Hey everyone, this is Josh with SKAA. Today I want to show you some deeper features when using SKAA speaker clusters. So first, let me just recap what speaker clusters actually are. Speaker clusters allow you to control bonding and searching for sources, switching sources, and volume controls all from a single speaker, instead of having to control these things individually at each speaker. You can do this with an array of up to 4 speakers. So next, let's go through the cluster up process with 2 speakers. Again, clusters are groups of SKAA receivers which work as one, so that's why I've got my multi-mode Ryobi score primary set to SKAA mode for this demonstration, because I need them to behave as SKAA receivers for them to be part of a cluster. You first make sure that both speakers are off, and make sure that any transmitters are turned off as well, and then turn on the speaker that you want to be the cluster master while holding the bond button. You'll see a rapid red blinking light. While that's blinking, turn on the slave speaker. The light will flash here as well. Wait for the red light to stop flashing on each of these, and then power both speakers off. We've now created a simple cluster of 2 speakers. I'll turn on my transmitter again, and when I turn the speakers back on again, they will now automatically bond to the same audio source. And when I add this source to my green list, the slave speaker will follow the green list of the master. If you have more than one source saved in your green list, we can now switch between these by just controlling the cluster master. And you can also simultaneously control the volume of both speakers as well. To remove a speaker from a cluster, turn all of the speakers off and just individually power up each speaker while holding down the bond button, and you'll see the red light flash again. Wait for the light to stop blinking, then power down that speaker. Repeat this process for each speaker individually to remove them from the cluster. What you're actually doing here is effectively making each speaker a cluster of 1. Clusters are really an optional thing. Not everyone will need to use them. But clusters can be really handy if you have multiple speakers in a large array and you don't want to have to control each speaker individually, especially when the speakers might be spread out around the house or far away from each other. You can repeat this same process to create a cluster of up to 4 speakers. I'll just make sure that my 2 Ryobi primaries are set to SKAA mode. You'll see that the different pieces of the cluster bond at different times. Note that the slaves don't bond until the master does, but keep in mind that the master and slaves all communicate with the transmitter. The members of the cluster aren't actually communicating with each other except for during the cluster up process. Note that volume controls are not specifically limited to the master speaker. You can actually control volume or mute from any of the members of the cluster. However, bonding and green list functions can only be done from the master. Using the SKAA command app, speaker clusters show up like this, all as a single unit, with 1 volume control. Note that the first green bond block, the one in the top left corner, is always the master of the cluster. You can also click on each one of these bond blocks to change the stereo format of each speaker. Since the slaves will bond in a random order, when you're setting the stereo format, just turn one slave on at a time so you know which one you're adjusting. And it doesn't hurt to mark your speakers with masking tape with L's and R's on them so you know which speaker is set to what. Notice how missing slaves, ones that are turned off or out of range or otherwise absent, show up as empty boxes here in SKAA command. So just looking at these bond blocks tells me that this cluster is supposed to have 4 members, but 2 of them are missing right now. They're not bonded for some reason. Just one note on Nadia hubs like the score primary here. Don't ever make a Nadia hub a master of a cluster unless you plan to always use it as a SKAA receiver. If I make a several piece cluster with the score primary as the master and I put the hub into any other mode than SKAA mode, the master receiver essentially disappears to the cluster and none of the slaves in the cluster will be able to bond to any transmitter. This is why in all of my examples in this video, I used a Ryobi secondary speaker as the master receiver. Another thing to note is that you can only create clusters within the same family of speakers. So for example, I can't create a cluster with a Ryobi score speaker and my Go Rave home theater system. However, I can create a cluster with my Go Rave soundbar and Go Rave subwoofer. Speaking of subwoofers, the volume control of subwoofers functions a little differently when they're a slave in a cluster. Normally, the volume buttons on a speaker control a parameter called BVTR, a parameter which affects volume for all members of the cluster. This is the same parameter which is controlled by a receiver or a cluster's volume slider in SKAA command. But the volume buttons on a subwoofer, which have been set up as a slave in a cluster, usually control a parameter called NVTR. This means that it basically just controls its own volume, not others. This is because the volume of the sub needs to have its own separate control relative to the other speakers. So you can just adjust the entire BVTR volume of the entire cluster from SKAA command or one of the speakers, and then tweak the NVTR, which will only affect the sub's volume, using the volume controls on the sub itself. Another thing I should bring up when it comes to SKAA clusters is the dormant green list. When you add a source to your green list on the master speaker, the green list is not saved to the green list of all of the speakers, just to the master speaker. But say you had 3 transmitters green listed on a particular speaker, and then you made that speaker into a slave in the cluster. The slave speaker's green list will be inactive and will remain dormant, and at this point the slave will follow the green list of the master. However, if you uncluster the slave speaker, the slave's green list will return and function normally again. One last thing I want to discuss is that sometimes LED colors in the cluster will not match when all nodes are not bonded. So remember that the master only communicates to the slaves via the transmitter, never directly, except during the cluster up process. So if you have unbonded, unmatching LEDs, this is simply a result of how the speakers communicate. Alright, so I hope this deeper look into SKAA speaker clusters was informative. You can find all SKAA transmitters at skaastore.com, and you can find the Ryobi Score speakers at the Home Depot. If you like this video, please leave us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel to see more content like this. Thanks for watching.